Caroline Bennett pulled her sleeve down one last time before she stepped out of the carriage. A small, practiced motion she had performed so many times, it had become invisible even to herself. Then she walked into that church and married a stranger. Nathaniel Whitaker saw nothing wrong. He saw a quiet bride with steady hands and dry eyes. He did not yet know what she was hiding beneath the silk. He would not know until the night changed everything. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe and follow until the very last word. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Virginia, 1818. July. The summer heat pressed down on the little white church like a hand trying to keep something buried. The windows were open, but no air moved through them. The pews were packed with people who had come not out of celebration, but out of curiosity. Because when Nathaniel Whitaker of Whitaker Hall finally took a bride after 36 years of solitary living, every soul in 3 counties wanted to see what kind of woman had managed it. What they saw was Caroline Bennett, 22 years old, daughter of Thomas Bennett, whose name had once meant land and breeding and old Virginia respectability, and now meant debt and whisper and polite avoidance at the general store. She wore her mother's altered gown, ivory silk, gone slightly yellow at the edges, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers because there had been no money for anything cultivated. Her hair was pinned back without a single curl. Her face was composed. Too composed. Nathaniel stood at the front of that church and watched her walk the length of the aisle, and he counted her steps. 31. He counted them because he was a man who noticed things, who had learned in the war that the distance between one place and another could mean everything, and because watching her walk toward him was doing something strange to his carefully ordered thoughts. She didn't look at the guests. She didn't look at the flowers someone had tied to the end of each pew. She looked straight ahead, and her eyes were fixed not on his face, but on a point somewhere just past his left shoulder, as if she were navigating by a landmark only she could see. She reached him, stopped, looked up. Their eyes met for the first time that morning. He had met her twice before. Once at a formal dinner at the Bennett house 3 months ago, when Thomas Bennett had orchestrated the whole thing with the careful precision of a man selling property, and trying not to show how desperate he was to close the deal. Once in the lawyer's office in Richmond, signing documents that transferred considerable sum from Nathaniel's account to the resolution of Bennett's debts in exchange for this marriage. Both times Caroline had been present, and both times she had spoken exactly as much as was required, and not one word more. He had thought her cold. Standing this close, he understood he had been wrong about what he was seeing. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly. "Mr. Whitaker," she answered. Her voice didn't shake. That was the thing he would remember later in the long months that followed. Her voice never shook. Whatever else moved through her, whatever storms were running beneath that composed surface, her voice came out steady every single time. The ceremony was short. The preacher was a practical man who understood that the assembled crowd's patience had limits, and that the heat was genuinely oppressive, and he moved through the words with the efficiency of someone who had spoken them so many times. They had become almost architectural load-bearing phrases that held the structure together without ornamentation. "Do you take this woman?" "I do." "Do you take this man?" A pause. Not long. A breath's worth. The kind of pause that most of the assembled guests would forget by the time they reached their carriages. Nathaniel did not forget it. "I do." She said it. Clearly. Without hesitation if you were counting only time. But he had been watching her hands, the small bunch of wildflowers she held, the way her fingers were wrapped around the stems, and in that breath before she answered, he had seen her grip tighten. Not a tremor. A decision. A conscious act of will. "I do." The ring was plain gold. He had not presumed to know her taste in stones, and something in him had resisted the idea of choosing jewelry for a woman he did not know, so he had kept it simple. He took her hand to place it, and felt for just a moment the slight tension in her fingers before she allowed her hand to rest in his. She received the ring the way you receive news that has already been decided. The reception was held in the yard behind the church because the church itself was too small, and Bennett Hall was in no condition to receive guests. Nathaniel had arranged and paid for the food without being asked because he had seen enough of Thomas Bennett's circumstances to know that the man would not be able to manage it, and he had done it quietly and without comment because he did not want his new wife beginning her married life in public humiliation. He stood now at the edge of the gathering with a glass of lemonade. He wasn't drinking and watched Caroline move through the guests. She was graceful. He noticed that. She accepted congratulations with the right words and the right expressions. She listened when the older women gave her advice she hadn't solicited. She laughed at the right moments. She was performing the part of a happy bride with sufficient skill that most of the room believed her. Nathaniel did not believe her. I was watching the spaces between the performances. The half-second of stillness before she turned to greet someone new. The way her eyes moved, not wandering or daydreaming, but tracking the way a person tracks a room when they need to know where all the exits are. She was managing the space around her. She was always constantly managing. Why Thomas Bennett appeared at Nathaniel's elbow with the smooth entrance of a man who had spent decades perfecting his social approach. A fine occasion, Bennett said. He was perhaps 50, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and still remembered it. He smiled easily. His eyes were a pale cold blue that didn't change expression when the rest of his face did. "You've done well by us, Whitaker. The girl will make you a fine wife." The girl. Not her name. Not my daughter. The girl as if she were a piece of furniture he'd had reupholstered. "I expect we'll do well enough," Nathaniel said. It was not an agreement. Bennett didn't notice the distinction. "She's got her mother's temperament." Bennett continued taking a drink from his own glass. "Quiet. Manageable. She won't give you trouble." He paused, seemed to consider something. "She may take some time to settle. She's been sheltered, at home. But she's an obedient girl at heart." Nathaniel looked at him steadily. "I'll form my own opinions, I reckon." Something flickered across Bennett's face. Not offense exactly. More like the brief recalculation of a man who has misjudged the temperature of a room. He smiled again wider. Of course, of course." He lifted his glass slightly. "To the future." Nathaniel did not lift his. The carriage ride to Whitaker Hall took 2 hours over roads that the summer heat had turned to dust. Nathaniel sat across from Caroline in the enclosed space and noted that she sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and her face turned slightly toward the window, though there was nothing visible through it but the blur of trees and the occasional farmstead. He had intended to begin establishing some kind of civil understanding on this journey. He had, even in the days before the wedding, composed a few topics of conversation in his head. Practical matters. Questions about her preferences regarding household management. A brief explanation of how Whitaker Hall was organized and what her role in it would be. He said none of it, because 5 minutes into the journey without turning from the window she said, "You don't have to speak if you don't want to. I don't require conversation." He looked at her. "Most men." She continued, still not looking at him. "Find it easier if I don't talk much. I'm accustomed to it." "Who told you that?" She turned then, and for a moment something moved through her expression. Surprise maybe, or the wariness that looks like surprise from a distance. "I beg your pardon. Who told you men prefer it when you don't talk?" She studied him for a moment, the way you study a road you're not sure you can trust. "It was simply something I learned." "Learned from who?" A pause. "From living." He let that sit for a moment. Outside a hawk crossed in front of the carriage window, low and purposeful. "I was in the army," Nathaniel said. 8 years. I've been around men who don't talk much, and men who talk too much, and everything in between. In my experience, the ones who insist on silence from others are usually afraid of what they might hear. She didn't answer. "I'm not afraid of what I might hear," he said. "And I am not your father." The last sentence came out harder than he'd intended, and he saw it land, saw her chin come up slightly, the very faint adjustment in her posture that wasn't quite drawing back and wasn't quite squaring up something between the two. "No," she said carefully. "I can see that." "Good." He looked out his own window. "Then you can talk or not talk as you please. Either way, I'll manage." After a moment, she said, "What was it like, the army?" He glanced at her. She had turned back to the window, but her posture had changed. Something had eased in it barely perceptibly, the way a held breath releases. "Loud," he said, and then very quiet, and then loud again. "Were you afraid?" Every man who tells you he wasn't afraid in a battle is either a liar or a fool. She considered this. "I think," she said quietly, "that is the most honest thing a man has ever said to me." Whitaker Hall was large, not ostentatious. Nathaniel had no patience for ostentatious, but large, with the solidity of a house that had been built to last and then maintained with the same deliberate care. The grounds were in order. The outbuildings were clean. When the carriage pulled up, there were 3 people waiting on the front steps. Mrs. Hooper, who had been Nathaniel's housekeeper for 11 years, and whose expression of composed welcome suggested she had opinions about this marriage that she was keeping strictly to herself. James, who was 17 and worked the stables and was openly curious in the way that teenagers are before they learn to pretend they aren't. And Ruth, who was 40-something and had cooked at Whitaker Hall for 6 years, and was looking at the new mistress with the particular sharp attention of a woman who wants to know immediately whether there is going to be trouble. Caroline stepped down from the carriage and looked at the house, and Nathaniel watched her face. He had expected, he wasn't sure what he had expected. Some version of the calculated performance he'd seen at the reception, perhaps. Some careful social navigation. Or maybe the opposite, some indication of relief now that the public portion of the day was over. What he saw was something else. She looked at the house the way someone looks at a door they've been told to walk through but aren't yet sure what's on the other side. Not fear, not hope, assessment. "Mrs. Hooper," he said, "this is Mrs. Whitaker." "Welcome, ma'am," Mrs. Hooper said, with the inflection of a woman who reserves her genuine welcomes. "Thank you," Caroline said. She looked at the housekeeper steadily. "I don't know this house yet. I'll be asking you a great many questions in the coming weeks if you're willing." Something shifted in Mrs. Hooper's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but its precursor, a slight recalibration, a reopening of the possibility of warmth. "Of course, ma'am," she said. "I know every corner of it." "Good. I'd rather learn than assume." They dined formally that first evening, the 2 of them at opposite ends of a table built for 12. Nathaniel had thought about this in advance, and had briefly considered having Ruth set a smaller table somewhere less ceremonial, but had ultimately decided that maintaining normal routine was probably the most respectful approach. He did not know Caroline. He did not know what she needed. He would start with normalcy and adjust from there. The food was good. Ruth had made an effort. Caroline ate with appetite, but without excess, and she commented on the beans, how they were seasoned. Whether that was rosemary, and Nathaniel said he believed it was, and she said her mother had grown rosemary. She used to sit in the kitchen garden with her when she was small, and then she stopped as if she had said more than she intended. "Your mother," Nathaniel said. "She passed when I was 14. She said it simply, without the performance of grief or the performance of recovery. Simply a fact. She was ill for 2 years first." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She looked at her plate. "After that it was just my father and me, and whatever staff he could still afford, which became less and less over time. It was more than she had volunteered about herself in all their previous meetings combined." Nathaniel understood it for what it was. Not intimacy, but a kind of tentative testing the extension of a small piece of truth to see what would happen to it. He treated it carefully. "You managed the household." "I did, from the time I was 16. A pause. "I know how to manage a household, Mr. Whitaker. I know accounts and provisions and the coordination of staff. I want you to understand that I'm not without practical use." He looked at her directly. "I never thought you were. You thought something. Most people think something when they look at me now." She met his eyes briefly before looking away again. "The bankrupt colonel's daughter who married her father's creditor. They're writing a story about me in their heads." "I expect they are," he said. "People generally do. I've found it's not worth too much concern what stories people tell about us in their heads." "No," she agreed softly. It's only the ones they tell out loud that cause damage. He set down his fork, looked at her. She was looking at the candle flame, and her profile was very still. Caroline, he said. She looked at him. I made a contract with your father, he said. I want to be clear about what that means to me, since apparently clarity is in short supply in this situation. It means his debts are settled. It means this house is yours to manage as you see fit with Mrs. Hooper's help. It means you will not want for anything that is in my ability to provide. That is what I agreed to. She watched him. It does not mean, he continued, that I own you. It does not mean you owe me silence or agreement or anything beyond basic courtesy, which I will also offer you. I am not... He stopped, picked his words. I don't expect you to be happy about this arrangement. I don't require happiness. But I do require honesty. If something is wrong in this house, I expect you to say so. If I do something that troubles you, I expect you to say so. Not to manage it quietly or pretend it isn't happening. Are we understood? The candle flame moved in a breath of air. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She was quiet for a moment. Someone who would explain my place to me. I don't reckon you need it explained. Something moved through her face too brief and too complex to name. She looked back down at her plate. No, she said quietly. I don't. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, Nathaniel stood in the upstairs corridor outside what was now her room and was about to turn toward his own when he heard it. Not a sound exactly. An absence of sound where he had expected movement. He'd assumed she would be getting settled opening trunks, the normal small industry of a person arranging themselves in a new space. But the silence from behind her door was the kind that had weight to it. He knocked, twice lightly. A pause. Yes. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. Another pause longer. Then, yes. Thank you. He almost left. He had turned slightly and then stopped because something about the particular quality of that pause, its length, its texture made him say, "Are you all right?" The silence that followed was different from the others. It was the silence of someone deciding something. Mr. Whitaker. Her voice came through the door, and it was steady as it always was, but there was something else in it now, something underneath the steadiness. May I ask you something? Yes. If I needed? Another pause. If there were a matter involving my father, something he might attempt, would this house be? She stopped. He waited. Would I be safe here? She finally said. The sentence came out level and clean, like a question she had been holding for a long time and had finally decided to release. Nathaniel stood very still in the corridor for a moment. Would I be safe here? Not is this house comfortable. Not am I welcome here. Not any of the questions a new bride might ask in ordinary circumstances. This question had a different shape. It came from a different place. Yes, he said. The word came out quieter than he intended, and more certain. Yes, Caroline. You are safe here. The pause after was the longest yet. Thank you, she said. Good night, Mr. Whitaker. Good night. He walked to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time, and in his mind he was replaying the day, not the ceremony or the reception or the dinner conversation, but the small things. The tightened grip on the wildflowers. The tracking eyes. Most men prefer it when I don't talk. The practiced composure that never quite reached her hands. Would I be safe here? He had made a contract with Thomas Bennett. He had bought himself a household manager and a socially acceptable wife, and the end of his neighbor's concern about his bachelor state, and he had told himself that was sufficient and practical and exactly what the situation called for. He had not bought a woman who was afraid. He had not signed up to be the solution to something he didn't yet fully understand. He had not agreed to feel the thing he was currently feeling, which was a slow and cold anger at a man he had shaken hands with that morning. He rose from the bed, went to the window. Outside, the Virginia summer night was thick with heat and insects, and somewhere on the property, a dog was barking at something distant, and the stars were hard and bright in the way they got in July, when the air was too heavy to hold anything soft. He thought about what Thomas Bennett had said at the reception. Quiet. Manageable. She won't give you trouble. Obedient. The words of a man describing property. Nathaniel had seen it in the war men who talked about certain things, certain people as property, as items, as tools whose value was entirely measured in use. He had seen what that thinking produced. He had held men whose lungs had given out and listened to what they said in their last moments, and not one of them had ever said anything about how well they'd managed their property. He stood at that window for a long time. When he finally went to bed, he had made a decision. He was not entirely certain what it would require of him, or how long it would take, or what it might cost. He knew only that it was the right one the way he had known certain things in the field, not because someone told him, but because everything in him aligned around it. Caroline Bennett Whitaker had asked if she would be safe. He intended to make certain that the answer remained yes. She came down to breakfast the next morning in a pale blue dress, her hair neater than the day before, and found that he was already at the table with coffee and a document he was reviewing. She stopped in the doorway for just a moment, not long, not visibly, and then entered and took the chair at the corner of the table, neither beside him nor at the opposite end. The middle ground. Mrs. Hooper brought coffee without being asked. Caroline thanked her. Nathaniel set down his document. Did you sleep? Reasonably. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The room is comfortable. Thank you for it's a pleasant room. It was my mother's sitting room. I thought it might suit. He paused. You can arrange it however you like. Move the furniture. Change whatever doesn't work. She looked up at him with that slight expression of calibration, the look she used when he said something that didn't fit the pattern she'd expected. All right, she said. I'll be out on the Southfields today. There's a dispute about a fence line that needs my attention. He picked up his coffee. Mrs. Hooper will show you whatever you want to see. The accounts are in the study if you want to look at them. The household runs well, but if you find anything that should be done differently, I expect you to change it. You're giving me authority over the household. You said yourself you know how to run one. A pause. Yes, I did. Then run it. He stood, picked up his document. I don't see the point of having a person capable of a thing and then putting obstacles in front of them. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not quite surprise, not quite suspicion. Something between those two things. Something trying to decide which direction to move in. Mr. Whitaker, she said. He looked at her. Why? She asked. It was a simple word, but it carried considerable weight, and they both understood what it was asking. Not why the fence line, not why the accounts. Why any of it? Why are you doing this? Why are you treating me like a person whose choices matter? He considered the question. Set down the document again. I had a friend, he said. In the army, Thomas Carey. Good man, good officer. He came home and married a woman his family had chosen, and she was... He stopped. She was not treated well. And Thomas Carey was too much of a coward to see it because seeing it would have required him to do something about it, and doing something about it would have been complicated and expensive and difficult. He paused. Thomas Carey died of typhus 2 years after the war. I went to the funeral and his wife stood at the graveside, and there was something in her face. He looked for words. Relief is not the right word, but it was adjacent to relief. Caroline was very still. I decided then, Nathaniel said, that I would not be Thomas Carey. The morning light came through the windows behind her and made it difficult to read her expression clearly. But he thought he was not certain, but he thought that something in her face moved. Not the practiced movement of performance. Something real and small and careful. He left her nothing, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He left her the house. The debts outweighed it. He picked up the document again. I'll be back before supper. He was almost through the door when she said, Mr. Whitaker. He paused. My name is Caroline, she said. Not the girl, not Mrs. Whitaker if you don't mind. Caroline. He turned slightly. In the morning light, she looked different from how she had looked in the church or the carriage or at the dinner table, Not softer exactly, but more present, as if she were allowing slightly more of herself to be visible. "Caroline," he said. "All right. And mine for you is Nathaniel, if that suits." "It suits," he said. And he went out to settle a dispute about a fence line. And in the kitchen, Mrs. Hooper told Ruth that she'd expected the worst, and wasn't yet sure she wasn't getting it. And Ruth said she thought the woman seemed steady enough, and in the sitting room that had once been Nathaniel's mother's, Caroline Bennett Whitaker, opened the household accounts and began to read, and for the first time in longer than she could easily calculate, no one was in the room with her, and no one was watching, and she was not afraid. Not afraid. She held on to that for a moment, the sheer strangeness of it. Then she turned to the first page and began. The accounts were worse than she'd let on. Caroline had known this since the second morning when she'd finished the first ledger and started the second, and found a pattern that most people would have missed, but that she, having lived inside her father's financial disasters for 6 years, recognized immediately. Not catastrophe. Nothing dramatic. Just the slow, quiet leak of a household that had been managed by people who were competent but not watchful. Small redundancies in supply orders, as a feed contract that had been renewed at a rate higher than the current market, 3 positions on the payroll that appeared to be doing the work of 2. She said nothing about it for 4 days. She watched. She walked the house and the outbuildings with Mrs. Hooper, who was precise and knowledgeable and warming to her by degrees, the way a cast-iron pan warms slowly, evenly, and then suddenly it holds heat better than anything. She spoke with Ruth about the kitchen provisions. She sat in the study in the evenings after supper and read through documents going back 3 years, and she made notes in a small leather book she'd brought from home, and she did not yet say anything to Nathaniel because she did not yet know how. Not because she was afraid of his reaction. That was the strange thing she kept circling back to, like a tongue finding a sore tooth. She was not afraid of his reaction. She was uncertain of his response, which was different. Fear is about self-protection. Uncertainty is about not yet knowing the shape of a thing. She was learning the shape of Nathaniel Whitaker, and it was not the shape she had been given to expect. He came to breakfast every morning at the same time. He asked her one question and listened to the full answer before he responded. He did not interrupt. He did not correct her in front of the staff, and on the one occasion when he disagreed with a decision she'd made about the linen inventory she'd ordered less than he thought was needed. He said so to her directly in the study, without raising his voice. And when she explained her reasoning, he considered it without dismissing it and said, "All right, you may be right. Let's see how it goes. Let's see how it goes." She had written those words in her small leather book that evening and looked at them for a while. She had lived 22 years in a house where decisions once made by the man in charge did not get revisited. Where being right about something did not protect you from being punished for the implication that someone else had been wrong. She had learned to be useful without being visible, to solve problems quietly and let the credit dissolve into the general air where no one had to acknowledge it. "Let's see how it goes" was a foreign language. She was beginning slowly to learn it. It was Mrs. Hooper who finally created the opening. The two of them were reviewing the supply accounts on a Thursday morning, going through the figures with the focused efficiency that Caroline had begun to enjoy. Mrs. Hooper was sharp and direct, and did not waste words, qualities Caroline had come to respect deeply when the housekeeper set down her pen and said without particular preamble, "You've found the feed contract." Caroline looked up. "Yes. Been meaning to renegotiate it for 2 years. Mrs. Hooper said it flatly. "Mr. Whitaker isn't. He's a man who knows land and livestock and men. Numbers on a page less so. He manages the larger accounts. He manages the property. The daily household runs through me, and I'm better with organization than arithmetic." She met Caroline's eyes with the directness that was simply her nature. "You've been making notes." "I have." "You going to tell him what you found?" Caroline considered the question more carefully than its surface required. "I was trying to determine the right way to do it." Mrs. Hooper made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Straight out is the right way with him. He doesn't like hedging. Just say what you found and what you think should be done about it." She paused. "He won't take it wrong. He's not that kind of man." "I know," Caroline said. And that was the thing. She did know. She had come to know it through 4 days of careful watching, and the knowledge sat in her chest, like something she hadn't expected to find there, and didn't quite know what to do with. He was not that kind of man. And she kept running into that fact the way you run into furniture in a dark room, not painfully, but with enough surprise that it registered every time. She told him that evening at supper. She had planned to wait until after the meal, thinking it was cleaner to conduct business at a business time. But he asked how the accounts were coming, and she looked at him across the table and said, "I've found several things." He set down his fork. "Tell me." So she did. Clearly, with the specifics, she'd noted down the figures and the comparisons and the redundancies she'd identified. She watched his face while she talked. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How much do you think we're losing annually on the feed contract alone?" She gave him the number. He picked up his fork, set it down again. "I've been paying that man too much for 3 years. You've been paying the rate you agreed to. The market moved. Which I should have tracked." He said it without defensiveness, just the flat acknowledgement of a man comfortable with his own errors as long as he could correct them. "What would you do about it?" "I'd renegotiate. The current market rate is, I'd need to confirm the figures in Richmond, but I believe it's considerably lower. I have a contact there who would know." He looked at her. "You have a contact in Richmond. My father's former solicitor. He's an honest man, which is why my father stopped using him." She paused. "He helped me when my mother died. He knows the current rates on most regional contracts." A longer pause. She held herself steady under his attention, because this was the part she had been uncertain about. Not the information itself, but whether she would be believed, whether she would be treated as someone whose knowledge was worth acting on, or as someone offering a suggestion that would be acknowledged and set aside. "Write to him," Nathaniel said. "Find out the current rates. We'll renegotiate by end of August." "All right. And the other redundancies. List them out, everything you've found. We'll go through them Saturday morning." She nodded, picked up her own fork. After a moment she said, "You're not bothered." "By what?" "By the fact that it was your household and I found the errors." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "Caroline, if I hired a doctor and he found I had a problem I hadn't noticed myself, would I be bothered that he found it? Most men would. Then most men are foolish." He returned to his food. "You found errors because you were looking for them, and you were looking because that's what the situation called for. I'd be a great deal more concerned if you'd found nothing." She ate her supper and said nothing more about it. But something had shifted in the air of the dining room, something so small that you might not notice it if you weren't paying close attention, but she was always paying close attention. The weight in the room had changed. Not dramatically, just by a degree. The way a key turns in a lock that has been stiff. You push, and then suddenly the mechanism gives, and the door is still the same door, and you are still the same person, but the relationship between you has changed. She was beginning to be real to him, not an arrangement, not a placeholder. A person with a contact in Richmond and an eye for feed contract discrepancies. She was not sure what to do with that, but she held it carefully all the way up the stairs to bed. That night, for the first time since arriving at Whitaker Hall, she didn't lie awake listening to the house. She slept. The letter from her father arrived on a Tuesday. Mrs. Hooper brought it to the study where Caroline was working, and the moment Caroline saw the handwriting on the envelope, her hands stilled. The housekeeper set it on the desk and withdrew without comment. She was perceptive in the quiet way of women who have spent years reading rooms, and Caroline sat for a moment without touching it. Then she opened it. It was short. Thomas Bennett wrote with the economy of a man who believes his words carry weight by virtue of who is writing them, without the bother of constructing an actual argument. He had heard from a neighbor that the Whitaker property was profitable this season. He was engaged in a new venture that required some initial capital. He would come to visit at the end of the month. He expected Caroline to speak to her husband about the matter. He did not ask how she was. He did not mention that he had sold her. Caroline folded the letter, sat with it folded in her hands. Her heartbeat had done something strange and quick when she first read it, but now it was steadying, and she was listening to it steady, The way she had learned to listen to her own body carefully without panic, because panic was a luxury that had never been available to her. She was still sitting like that when the study door opened and Nathaniel came in, having returned early from the north property because 2 of the fences had gone wrong. He stopped when he saw her face. What happened? She looked up. And then she did something she had not planned and had not predicted in herself. She held out the letter. Without preamble, without a constructed explanation. Just held it out to him. He crossed the room and took it. Read it. She watched his face while he did. The expression that moved through it was not dramatic. It was subtle, and it was cold, and it reminded her briefly of what he must have looked like before an engagement. All that stillness focused like a point. He finished reading. Set the letter on the desk between them. He wants money. He wants me to ask you for money on his behalf. Which you won't do. No. She said it clearly. I won't. He looked at the letter, then at her. He's coming at the end of the month. Yes. He will need to be told that this household is not available as a continuing resource for his ventures. The words were measured, deliberate. I can do that if you'd prefer not to. She thought about this. I need to be present when it's said. He looked at her. He needs to hear it with me in the room, she said. He needs to see. She paused, gathering the sentence properly. He's operated my entire life on the assumption that I have no standing, that I am a secondary party to any conversation about my own circumstances. I need to be present. Even if I say nothing, I need him to see that I am not separate from this. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. She could not entirely read his expression, but she felt its quality, the careful attention he brought to things he was taking seriously. All right, he said. You'll be present. She nodded, reached for the letter, folded it again, tucked it into the desk drawer. Thank you, she said. Then with effort, I know this wasn't what you expected when you made the arrangement. You weren't what I expected, he said. That's not a complaint. She looked up at him. Go ahead and eat supper, he said, and went back out to deal with the fences, and she sat in the study for another minute in the quiet and realized that her hands were completely still. The following week tested everything she'd built in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started on a Wednesday morning when she dropped a glass. She had been reaching for the water pitcher on the breakfast sideboard, and her sleeve caught the glass at the edge, and it fell and shattered on the floor, and the sound of it breaking went through her like a gunshot, because that was what it had always been in that house on Bennett property. Breaking things was never just an accident. It was a transgression, and transgression had a cost that her body remembered, even if her mind was working to tell it otherwise. She froze. It was only a second, maybe 2. Then she heard herself say evenly, I'll get a cloth, and she moved toward the kitchen door, and she was almost through it when Nathaniel said, Caroline. She stopped, did not turn immediately, pressed her hands flat against the doorframe for a moment, and then turned. He was standing across the room from her, and he hadn't moved toward her, and his face was doing something careful that she couldn't name. It's a glass, he said. Ruth has 12 more of them in the cupboard. She nodded. Knew that. Her body had not yet received the information. Are you cut? He said. No, I... She stopped, took a breath. No, I'm fine. All right. He looked at her steadily. Not with pity, not with the particular searching quality of someone cataloging a reaction for later use, just steadily. I'll get the cloth. Sit down. I can... Sit down, Caroline. She sat down. She did it because the alternative was to argue about getting the cloth, and she didn't have the composure for that right now. Not with her heart still running hard from the sound of breaking glass. Not with the 6 years of muscle memory. Still insisting that this was a different house and a different man, and there were consequences incoming. Nathaniel got the cloth, cleaned up the broken glass. Did it without comment, without efficiency that felt pointed, without any of the various ways a person can clean up a broken glass and also communicate something cutting about the person who broke it. Then he set the cloth aside, sat down at his own place, poured coffee into both cups and said, I forgot to tell you yesterday, I've decided to replace the fence on the east field completely, rather than patch it again. The posts are rotted through. She stared at him. What? He said. She stopped. Started again. You're talking about the fence. Yes. You're not going to... She stopped again. Looked at her coffee cup. Never mind. No, say it. She looked up at him. And she said because he'd told her he required honesty, and she'd been working to give it to him. You're not going to make anything of what just happened. He looked at her with that steady level attention. Something happened. She felt something crack open in her chest, just slightly. Not painfully. The way cold ground cracks in the first thaw, not breaking, just yielding. The fence, she said. Tell me about the fence. He told her about the fence. She listened, and her heartbeat slowed, and the morning continued. But she carried that moment with her all day. Turned it over. Examined it. The specific choice he had made to speak about the fence to make the broken glass into a thing that had simply happened and was simply handled to not use her reaction against her. She had not known that a person could do that. She had not known that was available. It sounds simple the way a lot of things sound simple once someone has shown you they are possible, but the showing is everything. In the kitchen that afternoon, Ruth said without looking up from the bread she was shaping. He's not a complicated man, ma'am. He just means what he does. Caroline looked at her. Were you listening this morning? Sound carries in this house something terrible. No apology in it, just fact. Ruth shaped a loaf with the practiced ease of someone who has made the same motion 10,000 times. Most men I've worked for, if a woman dropped something, there'd be a whole production. Either a rage or a performance of patience that was worse than the rage. She paused. He just cleaned it up. Yes, Caroline said. He did. That's who he is. Ruth set the loaf aside, finally looked at her. Took me about a month to believe it myself, but it's consistent. She went back to the bread. Consistent is rare. Consistent, Caroline thought. She turned the word over all the way back to the study. It was consistent. That was the thing she had been circling. That was the thing her body was slowly, reluctantly beginning to accept. Not that he was a good man, in the occasional way that made for a good story, but that it was structural. That it went all the way through. She sat down at the desk and opened the account books and worked steadily through the afternoon, and she was so focused that she almost missed the sound of horses in the yard. Almost. She went to the window and looked down and felt her stomach drop. Thomas Bennett's carriage. 2 weeks early. She stood at the window for 3 seconds, counted them. Then she went downstairs. He was already in the front hall when she reached it, having been let in by James, who didn't know better, and he was looking around the hall with the expression of a man appraising real estate, which was functionally what he was doing. Caroline. He spread his arms, the picture of fatherly warmth. You look well, my dear. Father. She did not move toward him. You're early. The roads were better than expected. He took off his hat, smiled. This is a fine house. Very fine. Whitaker has done well for himself. He has. Her father looked at her for a moment with those pale assessor's eyes. You seem settled, he said. The word settled in his mouth meant something specific. It meant useful. It meant functional. It meant that he was gauging whether she had sufficiently embedded herself to be of use to him. I am, she said. Good. He turned the hat in his hands. I thought I'd come a little early, have a proper visit. I'd like to speak with your husband. He's on the north property. He'll be back for supper, I expect. Father. She said it quietly, and something in the quietness made him look at her again more carefully. Why are you here? He studied her. I told you in my letter. You wrote that you had a new venture. You did not explain it. Explain it. His expression shifted. Not anger, he was too practiced for immediate anger, something shrewder. Caroline, let's not be unpleasant. I'm not being unpleasant. I'm asking a direct question. There's a land opportunity in the western counties, a partnership. The initial investment is... No. He stopped. She met his eyes. Her hands were at her sides, and they were perfectly still. No, Father. I won't ask Nathaniel for money on your behalf. I won't facilitate it. I won't arrange the conversation or soften the ground for it or be in the room and stay quiet while you make your case." The smile was entirely gone now. "You seem to have forgotten." "I haven't forgotten anything." Her voice did not raise. It stayed exactly where it was level and clear, the way she had taught it to stay across 22 years of practice. "I remember everything very clearly. That is actually the problem." He took a step toward her. She did not step back. This was new. She felt it herself, the novelty of it, her feet staying where they were. 2 weeks ago, she might have stepped back. A month ago, she certainly would have. But she was standing in a house that was hers to manage in a hallway she had walked 100 times now, and she was not, as she had told Nathaniel that first night, afraid. Not of her father. Not anymore. Or not only. Or not in the way that made her feet move. "You are my daughter," Thomas Bennett said. Low. The social warmth entirely stripped away now. "Yes," she said. "I was your daughter before I became your debt. I remember being your daughter. I remember what that looked like." She held his gaze. "This conversation is finished. You're welcome to stay for supper. Nathaniel will speak with you then. But you will not speak with me about money, and you will not speak about me as if I am an instrument. Those conditions are not negotiable." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. Then the front door opened, and Nathaniel came in early, the north property work apparently finished, and he took in the scene in the hall with the quick, complete assessment of a man trained to read situations. He looked at Caroline's face, then at her father's. "Bennett," he said, neutral. The word contained nothing and everything. Thomas Bennett turned his smile back on like a lamp. "Whitaker, good to see you. I've come early. Hope that's not an inconvenience." "It's fine." Nathaniel handed his hat to James, looked at Caroline. "All right." She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I was just explaining to my father that supper will be at 6. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment longer, reading something. She felt him reading something in her face, and then he looked at Thomas Bennett with the expression of a man who has already made several significant assessments and is in the process of confirming them. 6 o'clock, he said. "James will show you to the guest room." And then, he put his hand briefly, the lightest possible contact barely there, on Caroline's shoulder as he passed her toward the stairs. Not a claim, not a performance. Just a touch that said, "I see you, and I am here, and you are not alone in this house." She stood in the hall after they had both gone, her father toward the guest room. Nathaniel up the stairs, and she pressed one hand flat against the wall beside her and breathed. Her father was here. He was in this house. And she had stood in front of him with her feet still and her voice level and said no. And her world had not collapsed, and she was still standing. And in 4 hours, she would sit at a supper table with both of them, and she would be fine. She breathed in, breathed out. Consistent is rare, Ruth had said. Ruth had. She was beginning to understand what that meant. Not just about him, about what it might be possible slowly and carefully and without rushing to build. She straightened, walked back to the study, opened the accounts. Supper was in 4 hours, and she had work to do. Supper that night was the most precisely managed meal Caroline had ever sat through, and she had sat through her father's dinner performances for 22 years. Thomas Bennett was extraordinary at a table. She had always known this in the abstract, the way you know something about a person you've grown up watching but seeing it from the outside, from the other side of the table, from the position of observer rather than subject, was a different education entirely. He worked the conversation with the ease of a man who had been doing it so long it had become instinct. He asked Nathaniel about the property, the yields, the regional land market. He expressed informed opinions. He listened well enough to ask the right follow-up questions. He was charming and knowledgeable, and exactly as warm as the situation required. He did not look at Caroline for the first 20 minutes. That was the tell. She caught it early and filed it away, the deliberate way. He excluded her from his attention, not obviously, not rudely, but systematically, the way you exclude a variable from an equation because you've already accounted for it. She was accounted for. She was there. She had served her function by being married to this man, and now she was background. Nathaniel did not exclude her. That was the other thing she noticed. Every time her father subtly angled the conversation toward a two-person dynamic, Nathaniel turned it back. Not dramatically. He was too careful for drama. But he asked her opinion on the fall harvest projections, as if she had one worth hearing, which she did. Having spent a week on the accounts, and when she gave it, he listened, and then incorporated it into his next sentence to her father, as if her contribution were simply part of the conversation, which in this house it was. She watched her father process this, the slight recalibration behind his smile, the brief moment when he looked at her, really looked at her, and found something he hadn't expected. His daughter sitting at a table talking about harvest projections. His instrument, which had developed its own voice. After supper, Nathaniel suggested they move to the study. Caroline rose to go upstairs because she understood that certain conversations were conducted without her, and she had made her position clear that afternoon in the hall, and the rest could be Nathaniel's to manage. "Stay," Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "If you want to," he added. Not a command, the same distinction he always maintained. She sat back down. Her father's smile remained exactly where it was, but something behind his pale eyes flickered and went still. They went to the study, all three of them, and Nathaniel poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and then without asking, poured a third, and set it in front of Caroline. She didn't drink whiskey. He didn't know that yet. But the gesture was so deliberate and so quiet that she wrapped her hands around the glass and said nothing. Thomas Bennett made his proposal. It was well constructed, she had to give him that. He'd done his work. The land in the western counties was real, the opportunity plausible, the potential returns framed persuasively. He spoke for 7 minutes without interruption, and when he finished, he sat back and smiled and waited. Nathaniel said, "How much?" Bennett named a figure. Nathaniel looked at him. "That's not an investment, that's a rescue." The smile stayed. A strong investment often looks that way at the outset. "Mr. Bennett." Nathaniel set down his glass. "I've been in business long enough to know the difference between a man presenting an opportunity and a man presenting a need. You need money. You've built a case around it. That's your right, it's what I'd do in your position. But I'll answer you directly because I think that's better than letting this run on." He paused. No. The silence in the study was immediate and complete. "Now," Nathaniel continued with the same measured pace, "if there's something else I can help you with, practical matters regarding your property, a conversation about legitimate investment, I'm willing to have that conversation. But this particular request, I won't be accommodating." Bennett's smile had shifted. It was still present technically, but it had taken on a different quality, thinner, cooler, the version of the smile that preceded a change in tactics. "I had hoped," he said carefully, "that my daughter might have some influence on this matter." Both men looked at Caroline. She set her untouched whiskey glass down on the desk. "I do have influence," she said. "I've chosen not to use it in this direction." Her father looked at her with those pale eyes, and for a moment the performance dropped entirely, just a flash a second, the expression underneath the expression, and what she saw. There was not anger, not hurt, not even the cold calculation she'd grown up reading. It was something that took her a moment to identify. Surprise. Genuine surprise. He had not expected this. He had built his model of Caroline over 22 years, and in that model, she managed quietly, she absorbed, she did not refuse. He had sold her to a stranger and walked away confident that the pattern would hold, that she would find a way to be useful, that she would do what was necessary, that she would not have a position. She had a position. "I see," he said after a moment. "I hope you do," she said. He left the next morning before breakfast. There was no scene. Thomas Bennett was too practiced for scenes when they wouldn't serve him, but when he came downstairs with his bag and found Caroline in the hall, he stopped. "You've changed," he said. It was not a compliment. "I've had the opportunity to," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put on his hat. "You were always smarter than you let on," he said. "Your mother was the same." He walked past her toward the door. "It wasn't a quality I appreciated." He was gone before she could answer, which was probably correct. She didn't have an answer for that one. Some things she was learning didn't require answers so much as witnesses. She was the witness. That would have to be enough. She stood in the hall after his carriage had gone and breathed very slowly and evenly, and the thing she felt was not triumph and not grief and not relief exactly, but something that contained elements of all three. The complex feeling of a door that has finally truly closed. Mrs. Hooper appeared from the kitchen corridor, looked at her. "Breakfast is ready when you are, ma'am." "Thank you, Mrs. Hooper." "He was here less than 24 hours. "Yes." The housekeeper's expression shifted a small movement, almost imperceptible, but Caroline was good at reading small movements. "You ate a full breakfast this morning," she said. "That's the first time since you arrived." Caroline looked at her. "I'm usually not hungry in the mornings." "No," said Mrs. Hooper. "I noticed." And she went back to the kitchen. Caroline stood for another moment and then went into breakfast, and she ate, and the food tasted like something real, something real. The letter from Richmond arrived 3 weeks later. She had written to her father's former solicitor, Mr. Aldridge, as she had told Nathaniel she would, and his response was thorough and precise, in the way that had made him too honest for her father's business and too valuable to ignore. He confirmed the current feed contract rates. He included several other pieces of information she hadn't specifically requested, but that he seemed to understand she might need property tax assessments for the western counties. A note about 2 individuals whose names had appeared in connection with her father's new venture, and a brief careful paragraph at the end that she read twice and then set down. She sat with the letter for an hour before she found Nathaniel. He was in the barn working through an issue with the east fence materials. She waited until he'd finished his conversation with the farmhand and then said, "I have the Richmond figures." He read the letter. She watched his face do the same thing it always did, absorb, process, organize without performing any of it. Then he reached the last paragraph. "Read it. Read it again." Looked up. "Your father filed a legal claim," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Against this property." "Against the marriage contract." She said it evenly. "He's arguing the terms were inadequate. That the settlement of his debts was insufficient compensation for—" She stopped. Organized the sentence properly. "He's arguing he was owed more." Nathaniel was very still. "He sold me," she said. "And now he's arguing he sold me too cheaply." The words hung in this barn air between them. She had rehearsed several versions of this conversation in her head over the past hour, and in most of them, she was composed and factual and handled it the way she handled everything steadily without performing the feeling. She was still being steady. But she heard her own words and felt underneath the steadiness something hot and sharp that she recognized as fury, and she held on to the steadiness because the fury was too large to let out in this space. Nathaniel set the letter down. "He will not succeed." "I know. The contract is sound. Mr. Aldridge says so explicitly. I'll have my lawyer in Richmond respond, this week. I'd like to see the response before it's sent." He looked at her. "Of course." He paused. "Are you all right?" The question landed differently than she expected it to. Not as a social formality, not as the kind of thing people say to fill space. He was actually asking, looking at her face and asking. She considered lying. Considered the practiced steadiness that said, "Yes, I'm fine. I'm managing." Then she said, "No, not entirely, but I will be." He nodded once. The nod of a man who accepts that answer without requiring more from it. Then he picked up the letter. "I'll ride to Richmond tomorrow. I could write to Mr. Aldridge tonight. Prepare the ground." "Do that." He looked at her. "Thank you for bringing this to me directly. Did you think I wouldn't? Weeks ago, perhaps." He said it honestly. "Not now." She went back to the house, wrote the letter to Aldridge, wrote it clearly and without excessive language the way she'd learned to write everything, the facts, the required action, the expected outcome. She sealed it and set it aside, and then sat in the quiet study and let herself feel the fury for exactly 10 minutes, which was all she could allow before she needed to be functional again. Her father had filed a legal claim because she had said no. Because she had stood in that hall with her feet still and said no, and he had gone away and found another lever and was trying to pull it. She was not a daughter to him. She had never been a daughter to him. She was a resource that had stopped being manageable, and so he was trying a different kind of management. The 10 minutes ended. She put the fury somewhere it would keep, the way you put things in a cellar, not gone, not ignored, but contained and stored until it could be of use. Then she went downstairs and told Mrs. Hooper that Nathaniel would be leaving for Richmond in the morning and would need an early breakfast. The legal matter was resolved in 6 weeks. Nathaniel's lawyer was thorough, the contract was unambiguous, and Thomas Bennett's claim was dismissed without ceremony. Nathaniel returned from his second trip to Richmond with the paperwork and set it on the study desk in front of her without comment. She read every page. It took a while. When she finished, she looked up, and he was leaning in the doorway watching her with the patient stillness she had come to recognize as his version of presence, not crowding, not performing, just there. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She looked at the papers. "He'll find another angle eventually. Maybe." He pushed off the doorway, came and sat in the other chair. "Or maybe he'll recognize that this particular avenue is closed and move on. Men like your father are efficient with their energy. When something stops paying out, they redirect. You sound like you know the type. I've managed land in Virginia for 12 years. I've met every variety of that type." He paused. "Your father is not the worst I've encountered, which is either a comfort or a condemnation, depending on how you look at it." "Right now I'll take the comfort," she said. Something moved through his expression, at that something brief and warm, that she was beginning to learn was as much as he showed when something pleased him. She filed it the way she filed everything, carefully. She had been filing a great many things about Nathaniel Whitaker. The way he remembered things she had mentioned once and incorporated them without announcement. The rosemary in the kitchen garden, which had appeared in a small pot on the kitchen windowsill one morning without explanation. The way he read in the evenings with the focus of someone who considers reading an active rather than a passive pursuit, and occasionally read something aloud to her, not as a performance, but as the natural overflow of encountering something worth sharing. The way he handled disagreement directly without temperature, and then it was over, genuinely over, no residue. She was filing all of it in the place she kept things she was not yet ready to name. And then, on a Thursday in September, something happened that rearranged everything she had filed. She had been in the kitchen working with Ruth on the fall preservation. This was new. She had not done this at home. It was Ruth who had invited her in, and she'd found she genuinely liked the focused, practical work of it when she heard raised voices in the yard. Not Nathaniel's voice. Someone else. A man she didn't recognize. She and Ruth exchanged a look, and she wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. The man was perhaps 45, heavy through the shoulders, red-faced from either sun or anger or both. He was a neighbor, she could tell from the way James was hovering with the uncomfortable look of a young man trying to manage something above his authority. The man was angry about a water right, a creek boundary, something about his cattle and dry season, and who was owed what, how was loud. He was not at Nathaniel's level of loud, because Nathaniel was not loud at all. He was standing in the yard, listening with his arms at his sides, and his face completely still, which was, as she had learned, more formidable than any volume. But the neighbor was working himself up, and the words were getting rougher. And then the man said something about the marriage, something about Caroline specifically. A phrase about what Whitaker had paid for, crude and dismissive, the kind of thing men said when they wanted to diminish a person by making her a transaction. She walked out of this kitchen door. Nathaniel saw her immediately. His eyes moved to her face, reading it the way he always did, and then something in his posture shifted. Not anger. Something quieter than anger, and more dangerous. The neighbor noticed her, and his speech faltered. "Ma'am," he said reflexively, polite in the way of men who are rude about women in the abstract and awkward in front of them specifically. "I heard what you said," Caroline told him. Her voice was even. "About my husband's investment." The man's neck went red. "I wasn't, ma'am. I was speaking with your husband about a business matter." "You were speaking about me," she said. "As a transaction, as a thing that was purchased." She looked at him steadily. "I understand you have a grievance about the water rights. That's a legitimate conversation. My husband is a fair man, and he'll hear it fairly." She paused. But the way you get that conversation is to have it respectfully, not the way you were having it. The yard was completely quiet. The neighbor looked at her, at Nathaniel, back at her. He had the expression of a man who has been corrected by someone he had not expected to be corrected by, and who is working out in real time whether to be angry or ashamed. He took off his hat, held it. "I apologize, ma'am. It wasn't right." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She looked at Nathaniel. "I'll leave you to it." She went back inside. In the kitchen, Ruth was carefully not looking at her. "Bread needs turning," Ruth said. "Of course," Caroline said, and turned the bread, and her hands were steady, and she felt the kind of tired that comes not from exertion, but from having used something in yourself that you didn't entirely know was there. 20 minutes later, Nathaniel came in. Ruth found a reason to be in the pantry. He looked at Caroline for a long moment. She looked back. "The water rights," he said. "Resolved. Resolved." "Good." She turned the next loaf. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." "You didn't." He said it immediately without equivocation. "You had every right." He paused. He had no right to say what he said. Men say things like that. "Not in my yard." He said it with the particular quiet of a man who means what he says so completely that raising his voice would be redundant. "Not about my wife." She looked at him. Something in the word wife, the way he said it, not as a legal category, not as the term of the arrangement, but as something that meant this specific woman who has every right to stand in my yard and say what she said. She looked away, back at the bread. "I'll need to apologize to Ruth for the disruption," she said. "Ruth," Nathaniel said loud enough to reach the pantry. "Do you require an apology?" Ruth's voice came from behind the pantry door. "I require nobody apologizing for standing up for themselves in my kitchen. That's what I require." The tension in the room broke. Not shattered, eased, like a fist unclenching. Caroline felt it happen in her own chest, the slow opening of something she'd been holding clamped shut. She almost laughed. It surprised her the way it moved up from somewhere and nearly escaped before she caught it. She hadn't really laughed in so long that the almost felt enormous. Nathaniel saw it happen. She saw him see it, the slight change in his expression, that brief warmth she'd been learning to read. "Go on," Ruth said from the pantry. "Supper's in 2 hours and the bread is handled." They went to the study, sat across from each other with the afternoon papers between them, the way they had taken to doing on days when both of them had work. It was comfortable in the way that things become comfortable slowly through repetition, through the discovery that no one in the room is going to do anything you need to be braced for. After a while, Caroline said without looking up from her ledger, "You didn't say anything when I walked out there." "No. Most men would have, sent me back in, handled it themselves." "I reckon." He turned a page. "You didn't need handling." She looked up. "That man had things to say about me in your hearing, and you didn't. I expected you to be embarrassed." He looked at her over the papers, directly. "By what?" "By me making a scene." "That wasn't a scene," he said. "That was a woman telling a man he'd been disrespectful. There's a difference." He looked back down. "And I'm not generally embarrassed by the truth." She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended to. He was reading or appearing to read, and she was looking at the top of his head and feeling the thing she'd been filing carefully in the place where she kept things she was not yet ready to name, and she was beginning to suspect that the filing system was insufficient, that the thing she was filing was too large for the container she'd put it in, that it had been growing slowly and without her permission. Across 6 weeks of breakfasts and ledgers and broken glasses, handled as simply broken glass, and a note about rosemary in a pot on the windowsill. "And I am not your father, and you didn't need handling." "Nathaniel," she said. He looked up. She almost said it. The thing that was too large for its container. She felt it right there at the edge, the words almost organized enough to release. Then hoofbeats in the yard. Fast hoofbeats. Not a visitor's easy approach, but the urgent rhythm of a rider pushing hard. They both heard it. Nathaniel was at the window before she could move, and his face when he turned back told her something had happened. "It's Daniel Marsh," he said. Daniel Marsh was the foreman from the South Fields. "The East Field fence came down in the storm last night. We've got cattle on the Ridge Road." He was already moving toward the door, stopped, looked at her. She had half risen from her chair, the ledger still open in her hands. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "I know." She set the ledger down. "Go." He went. The sound of horses receded. The study was quiet. She sat for a long time in the empty room, with the thing she had almost said still sitting at the edge of her, unanswered and unresolved and entirely impossible to put back into the filing system it had outgrown. She picked up the ledger, stared at the numbers without seeing them. Outside, the September afternoon was cooling, and somewhere on the Ridge Road, Nathaniel Whitaker was chasing cattle, and she was sitting in his study in his house, that was her house too, managing accounts that were her accounts too, and she set the ledger down again. She picked up her pen, turned to a fresh page in her small leather book, the one where she kept her notes, her figures, her careful observational records. She had always used it for practical things. Facts, numbers, actionable items. She wrote 3 words, looked at them, closed the book. The cattle situation took until well after dark, which she had known it would. She had supper held and sat in the study with the lamp until she heard him come in. He stopped in the study doorway, dusty and tired, and she pointed at the plate Ruth had left covered on the corner of the desk. He sat, ate. She went back to the ledger which she had actually been working through for the last 2 hours, and the room was quiet and comfortable in the way it had learned to be. After a while he said, "You were going to say something, before Marsh came." She didn't look up. "Was I?" "Yes." She turned a page in the ledger. Her handwriting on the page was steady and clear, every column precise. "It'll keep," she said. He was quiet. She could feel him looking at her in the way he sometimes looked, reading, assessing, deciding something. "All right," he said. She kept her eyes on the ledger. "Good night, Nathaniel." "Good night, Caroline." I went upstairs. She listened to his steps on the stairs across the ceiling above her, the sound of a door. Then she opened her small leather book to the page with the 3 words, "I trust you." She looked at them for a long time. Then she closed the book, set it in the desk drawer, took the lamp, and went to bed. The leather book stayed in the desk drawer for 9 days. She didn't open it. She worked around it the way you work around something you've put down in a spot you're not sure about. You know, it's there, you account for it, you simply don't disturb it yet. The accounts kept coming. The harvest was in full motion, and the numbers were good, better than the previous year, by a margin that made Mrs. Hooper allow herself a small satisfied sound when Caroline showed her the figures. The household ran the way it had learned to run under Caroline's attention, smoothly, without drama, with the quiet efficiency of a well-tuned mechanism. Life at Whitaker Hall had found its rhythm. That was the simplest way to say it. The mornings had a shape now. The evenings had a shape. Even the silences had taken on a comfortable quality, the kind of silence that exists between people who have stopped performing for each other and haven't yet run out of things to say. She and Nathaniel had not run out of things to say. That surprised her still at odd moments. She would be in the middle of a conversation about crop rotation or regional politics, or the book he'd read the night before, and something in her would register the fact that she was talking. Actually talking. The way she had talked to her mother in the kitchen garden before everything changed, and the registration was always accompanied by the faint shock of the unexpected. She had not known she had this much to say. She had lived so long in a house where saying things had consequences that she had stopped knowing what she actually thought about most things. The thoughts had been there, she understood that now, but they'd been filed away in that same overstressed filing system, kept and maintained and never released. They were releasing now. One by one, in the mornings over coffee and the evenings in the study, they were finding their way out. And the strange thing, the thing she kept returning to, was that he received them. Not with performance, not with the exaggerated attentiveness of someone trying to seem like a good listener. He just listened. He responded. He pushed back when he disagreed, which she had come to appreciate in the particular way you appreciate things that once frightened you and have been converted into something useful. He disagreed with her sometimes. And the world did not end. She was still getting used to that. It was on the 9th day, a Tuesday, that Mrs. Hooper came to the study, with her jaw set in the way it got when she was managing something she considered beneath the dignity of the household, and said, "There's a woman at the door, ma'am. Says she's come to call." "Who is she?" "Mrs. Eleanor Haverford." The name carried a specific weight in Mrs. Hooper's mouth, not reverence, not contempt, but the careful neutrality of a woman who knows exactly where every person stands in a social structure and chooses her battles accordingly. Her husband manages the Haverford property east of here. She's brought 2 others with her. They're calling it a neighborly visit. Caroline set down her pen. "Is it? Mrs. Haverford has called twice since you arrived," Mrs. Hooper said. "You weren't receiving. She's persistent. She wants to look at me." "Yes, ma'am. That's the primary purpose of this call." Caroline was quiet for a moment. She understood what this was. She had been the subject of considerable regional speculation since the wedding. She'd heard enough secondhand from James and Ruth and the men who came to the property on business to understand that the narrative around her was still unsettled. The bankrupt colonel's daughter. The woman Whitaker had bought to manage his house. People wanted to see what the purchase looked like up close. She could refuse the call. She had been refusing it. But refusal, she was learning, was its own kind of statement. And the statement it made was that she was uncertain, and she was no longer uncertain. "Tell her I'll be down in 10 minutes. 10 minutes, she said, "and have Ruth put on tea." Mrs. Hooper's expression shifted. "Yes, ma'am." Caroline closed the ledger, looked at herself in the small mirror on the study wall. She was wearing her working dress, practical and well-made, but not formal. Her hair pinned back in the way she'd taken to wearing it since arriving at Whitaker Hall, neat, simple, functional. She considered changing, decided against it. She went down in exactly 10 minutes. Eleanor Haverford was perhaps 40, carefully dressed with the kind of social confidence that comes from having been the arbiter of local opinion for long enough that the position feels natural. She had brought 2 women who were slightly younger and slightly less confident, positioned on either side of her on the front parlor settee like supporting arguments. Mrs. Whitaker. She rose when Caroline entered, which was correct, and smiled with the particular warmth of a woman who is simultaneously welcoming and assessing. "How lovely to finally meet you." "Mrs. Haverford." Caroline sat in the chair across from them. "Thank you for coming." Ruth brought tea. The 3 women watched Caroline pour with the focused attention of people at an auction, and she poured with the ease of someone who had poured tea at her mother's table from the age of 9 and was not performing a thing. "We've heard such good things about your management of the hall," Mrs. Haverford said. "The improvements." "The house has good bones," Caroline said. "It didn't require much, mostly attention. Nathaniel was well, a bachelor household has certain qualities." She smiled. The word bachelor carried about 14 implications. "I imagine it's been an adjustment." "For both of us," Caroline agreed pleasantly. "He's a good man." One of the supporting arguments offered the younger one, dark-haired, with an earnestness that suggested she meant it simply. "My husband says there's no fairer man in 3 counties when it comes to a dispute." "I've found that to be true," Caroline said. Mrs. Haverford was looking at her with that particular bright attention, reading her doing the social calculus, running the numbers on who this woman was versus who she had been told this woman was. "You've settled in well," she said, and this time it was less a pleasantry and more a conclusion. "I have," Caroline said. "Your father was here recently." Caroline kept her expression precisely where it was. "Yes, a brief visit." He's a pause. The kind of pause that signals the speaker knows more than they're going to say. "He moves through the county a fair amount." "He does." "I hope the visit was pleasant." "It was informative," Caroline said. Something shifted in Mrs. Haverford's expression, a fractional realignment, a revision. She had come in here with a model of Caroline Bennett Whitaker, and the model was not matching the data. She had expected Caroline understood some version of the grateful transaction, the woman aware of her own fortunate positioning and performing appropriate humility about it. She had not expected this, whatever this was. The steady eyes, the unhurried sentences, the complete absence of the performance. "You're not what I expected," Mrs. Haverford said. She said it the way Nathaniel had said it those weeks ago, and Caroline had the sudden impulse to smile. "So I've been told," she said. The call lasted 45 minutes. By the end of it, Mrs. Haverford's posture had changed, opened, settled. The assessment concluded, and apparently landed somewhere in Caroline's favor, and she had issued an invitation to the regional harvest gathering that happened every October at the Haverford property, which Mrs. Hooper later told her had not been extended to this household in 4 years, due to some dispute Nathaniel had gotten into with Mr. Haverford over a drainage easement. "He'll tell you it was resolved," Mrs. Hooper said. "He won't tell you it cost him the invitation." Was it resolved to his satisfaction or to Haverford's? His. A pause. "You got the invitation back." Caroline filed that in the place where she kept things about what she was building here. Then she went back to the study, opened the leather book, and looked at the 3 words. She did not close the book this time. She turned to a new page and wrote a sentence. "Trust is one thing. This is becoming something else entirely." She looked at the sentence. It was accurate. She closed the book. The harvest gathering was on a Saturday in mid-October, and it was the first public occasion where she and Nathaniel appeared together as an established fact rather than a fresh event. And she understood this distinction in the way she understood most social mechanics completely and without having to be told. He came downstairs in his good coat and stopped when he saw her, and she saw him stop, and they looked at each other for a moment in the hallway. "You look..." He paused, seemed to be locating the word. "Different." "It's my better dress." "I know what it is." He looked at her steadily. "You look like you belong here." She felt the sentence land somewhere below her sternum. "I do belong here," she said, because it was true, because she had been building that truth deliberately for 3 months, and it was solid. Now she could feel its solidity. "Yes," he said. "You do." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The gathering was large. 40 people, at least the significant families of 3 counties, everyone who was anyone and everyone who wanted to be. She moved through it with Nathaniel at a pace that allowed conversation, and she talked to people and listened to people, and navigated the complex social geography of a community she was new to, and she did it without the performance she'd been practicing her whole life. She did it as herself. She did not know exactly when that had happened, the shift from performance to presence. But it had happened, and she could feel the difference from the inside, the way you can feel the difference between walking on ice and walking on solid ground. About an hour in, she found herself separated from Nathaniel by the natural drift of a crowded room. She was in conversation with a woman named Margaret Cole, who grew medicinal herbs on her husband's property, and had sharp, intelligent eyes and a directness that Caroline responded to immediately, and they had gotten deep into a conversation about what plants survived the Virginia winters when she heard her father's name. Not her father's voice, someone else's voice. Across the room behind her, 2 men talking with the confidence of people who believed they were out of earshot. She was not out of earshot. She had spent 22 years developing very good ears. "Bennett's filed another claim," one of them said. "Heard it from Aldridge's clerk, against the property." "That was dismissed," the other said. "Whitaker's lawyer, different claim, not the marriage contract this time. He's found a witness who says the land purchase in 15 was fraudulent, that Whitaker underpaid." Caroline kept her face perfectly still, continued the herb conversation with half her attention. The rest of it was entirely on those 2 voices behind her. "Whitaker's been managing that land for 3 years, the second voice said, skeptical. "Bennett's got documents, or he says he does." A pause. "If it holds, the east field goes back to dispute." The east field, the fence that had come down in September, the cattle on the ridge road. She knew that field. She knew its yield figures and its fence repair costs and its drainage issues and exactly what it produced annually. She also knew the 1815 land purchase records because she had gone through 12 years of property documents in her first month and filed everything in her head with the precision of someone who had learned that information was the only reliable currency. She excused herself from Margaret Cole with a promise to continue the conversation and crossed the room to where Nathaniel was standing with two other men, and she touched his arm lightly and said, "Could I have a moment?" He excused himself. They stepped away. She told him what she'd heard, quietly, efficiently, the facts only. Watched his face. He was very still. "He's using the 1815 purchase." That's what they said. A witness claiming undervaluation. There was no undervaluation. His voice was level. "I paid the assessed rate. It's documented. I know. I've read the documents." She held his gaze. "But I also know what he did with my mother's jewelry when he needed money, and the documentation on that was clear too." She paused. "Who witnessed the original 1815 sale?" He looked at her. "James Pritchard. He's gone west." "Who else?" A pause. His expression shifted. She saw him working backward through memory. "The surveyor. A man named Colbert. He was hired by the previous owner." "Is Colbert still in Virginia?" "I don't possibly. I haven't had reason to locate him." "We need to find him," she said. "Before my father does. Because if he finds a witness first, he'll also find a way to influence that witness. And Colbert in my father's pocket is a very different problem than Colbert as a neutral party." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The look had depth to it, not just the assessment she'd grown used to, but something additional. "You thought through all of that in the time it took you to cross the room." "I think fast when I'm angry," she said. "And I'm very angry right now." He held her gaze. "Colbert. I'll find him. I'll write to Aldridge tonight. He may know the current location." She paused. "My father is not going to have this property. I want to be clear about that. I'm not—" She stopped, reorganized. "This is my home. I'm not going to let him use me as a lever against it." Something moved through Nathaniel's face. It was the thing she'd been learning to read, the brief warmth, but tonight it was larger than she'd seen it before, more visible, less contained. "No," he said quietly. "He isn't." They stayed another hour because leaving immediately would have signaled disruption, and she was not in the habit of signaling disruption. She talked to Margaret Cole again and got her address. She talked to Mrs. Haverford and confirmed the details of a women's society meeting she'd been invited to. She stood at Nathaniel's side through the final round of conversations, and she was pleasant and engaged and entirely present. And underneath all of it, she was building the case. She wrote to Aldridge that night. Nathaniel sent a rider to Richmond the next morning with a separate inquiry. By Wednesday, they had Colbert's location. He was still in Virginia, had moved north to a property outside Fredericksburg, and by Friday, Nathaniel had ridden to see him. He came back on Sunday. She was in the study when she heard him come in, and she was at the study door before he reached it. He looked tired from the road, but his face was carrying something, a specific quality she'd learned to read. "He'll testify," Nathaniel said. "In our favor. He has his original survey notes. The assessed rate is documented." She breathed. "When?" "My lawyer will file the response this week. Bennett's claim will be seen by a circuit judge in November." He paused. "It's going to be all right." "I know," she said. Then, because honesty had become her practice, and she was not going to stop now, "I was frightened. Not that you would lose, I was fairly sure you wouldn't. But that he would find a way to turn it into something that hurt you. Because that's his particular skill. Finding the thing that matters to someone and using it." Nathaniel was quiet, looking at her. "This property matters to you," she said. "It does," he agreed. "And he knew it would be a way to reach—" She stopped. "He was using the property to reach me, because he knew I'd feel responsible. Because he sold me here, and if this went badly, it would be—" She stopped again. She had run past the edge of what she'd planned to say, and into the territory of what she actually felt, which was larger and less organized. "Caroline." His voice was quiet. She looked at him. "You are not responsible for what your father does," he said. "You never were." She nodded. She knew that. She had known it intellectually for years, and she was only now in these months beginning to know it in the places where knowing actually matters. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat and brought out a document, held it out. She took it. She read the first paragraph. Stopped. Read it again. This is... She looked up. This is my name. On the property deed. Yes. She stared at him. You added my name to the deed. I should have done it when we married. I didn't think of it then. I'm thinking of it now. He said it with the matter-of-fact steadiness he brought to everything, as if adding her name to 300 acres of Virginia property were simply a practical correction. You didn't have to? No, he agreed. I didn't have to. She looked back at the document. At her name written there in the formal language of legal fact. Caroline Whitaker, née Bennett. She was on this land. Not as his wife, not as a tenant, not as a managed person in a managed arrangement. She was on the deed. Nathaniel, she said. Yes. She looked up. He was watching her with that expression, the warmth, the careful restraint of a man who feels things significantly and has learned to hold them carefully, and she felt the thing in her chest that had outgrown its filing system, the thing she had been watching grow for 3 months without letting herself call it what it was. She called it what it was. I need to say something, she said. And I need you to let me finish before you respond. He nodded. When I married you, she said, I was surviving, that was all. I had no expectation of anything beyond that. A safe place to survive. You said I would be safe and I believed you, and I came in here ready to manage your house and stay out of your way and not ask for anything that wasn't in the contract. She paused, held his gaze. That is not what happened. He was very still. You read things aloud to me when they're worth sharing, she said. You put rosemary on the kitchen windowsill without telling me you'd done it. You cleaned up a broken glass and asked if I was cut. You stood in that yard in September while I spoke to your neighbor and you didn't flinch. She stopped. Her voice was steady. She was making sure of it. You added my name to the deed of a property I have not earned. You've earned... Let me finish, she said. He stopped. I have been afraid of men my entire life, she said. Not all men. The specific variety that believes their size and their authority and their money entitles them to use the people around them as instruments. I know how to recognize that variety. I've had 22 years of practice. She paused. You are not that variety. I know that now the way I know the accounts precisely with evidence with documentation going back to the first morning. I was watching her with an intensity she hadn't seen from him before, or hadn't let herself see. I trust you, she said. I wrote it down weeks ago and I couldn't say it. I'm saying it now. I trust you and I think... She stopped. The final sentence was right there. She had not planned to say it tonight. She had not planned to say it for months possibly. But she was standing in this study with her name on his deed, and 3 months of evidence behind her, and the thing had outgrown every container she had tried to put it in. I think I love you. And I don't know what you do with that, and I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just done keeping it in a desk drawer. The silence after was complete. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze because she had said it honestly, and she was not going to look away from it now. Then he said very quietly, What desk drawer? She blinked. My leather book. In the desk drawer. I wrote it down and put the book. It's a manner of speaking, Caroline. The way he said her name stopped her. It had a different quality than she was used to, not the steady practicality, not the careful management of tone. Something older and less rehearsed. I am not... He stopped. Tried again. I am not good at this. I know, she said. I wasn't asking you to be. I know you weren't asking. He moved then, not toward her, not dramatically, just a small shift of weight that changed the geometry of the room. That's not the point. He looked at her. I came back from Richmond the first time with the legal papers and you read every page. Do you remember what I thought watching you read? She shook her head. I thought... He paused, pressed his mouth briefly together the way he did when he was being precise. I thought that I had agreed to a contract and received something I had no name for. Something that read legal documents with more attention than my lawyer, and grew rosemary on windowsills, and stood in hallways with her feet still, and said no to men 3 times her weight. He stopped. I've been watching you build yourself back for 3 months. I didn't know that's what I was watching at first. And then I did, and I didn't know what to do with it because the last time He stopped again. The last time you what? She said. He looked at her directly. The last time I let myself care about someone's outcome more than my own, it ended badly. I told you about Thomas Carey, his wife. I didn't tell you the whole of it. She waited. I cared about her, he said. Before Carey married her. We were there was something that could have been something. And I was 26 years old, and I went to war, and I told myself it was better to leave it alone, that it was cleaner. That involvement was a complication I couldn't afford. He held her gaze without flinching. She married Carey. I came home, and she was what she was. And I have spent 10 years telling myself that caring about outcomes leads to complications, and that I am better suited to practical arrangements. Caroline was very quiet. You are not a practical arrangement, he said. It came out with the directness of a man who has been working up to something for months and has finally arrived. You have not been a practical arrangement for a very long time. She took a breath. What have I been? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the October night had gone cool, and somewhere in the yard one of the dogs was moving, and the house held them both in its familiar dark and quiet. Mine, he said. In the only way that I think means anything because you chose to be. Not because of the contract. Not because of the arrangement. He paused. And I believe I have been yours. For longer than I was ready to say so. She crossed the room. It was 6 steps. She counted them the way she had counted the steps at the altar because she was a woman who noticed distances, and this one mattered. She stopped in front of him, looked up. He raised one hand and touched her face. The side of her face. The backs of his fingers. The gesture of a man who is being very careful with something he doesn't want to damage. And she turned her face into that touch, the way a cold person turns toward warmth, the way a thing that has been held too tightly finally yields to open air. Nathaniel, she said. I know, he said. He did know. She felt that. She felt it in the careful way his hands framed her face, in the breath she heard him take, in the specific quality of the silence between them, which was no longer the silence of 2 careful strangers, but the silence of 2 people who have stopped being strangers and arrived somewhere neither of them had been expecting, and both of them, she understood, had been quietly hoping for without admitting it. She put her hand flat against his chest, felt his heartbeat through the fabric. Fast, she noted. His heartbeat was running fast. Good, she thought. So was hers. The night after she said it, after she had stood 6 steps across that study floor and put her hand against his chest and felt his heart running fast. Neither of them slept much. She was aware of that in the morning. She came downstairs, and he was already at the table, which was normal, but there was something different in the room, a new quality in the air, like the change in pressure before weather, except that what was coming was not a storm. She sat in her chair. He passed her the coffee without being asked. Their hands did not touch in the passing, but they both knew they could have, and that knowledge changed the weight of everything. The letter to Aldridge, he said. Did you finish it last night? Yes, James can take it this morning. Good. He opened his paper. She opened her ledger. The morning continued. But differently. Everything the same and everything different, the way the world looks from the same window after rain, same shapes, new light. Mrs. Hooper noticed within the hour. Caroline could tell by the way the housekeeper moved through the kitchen corridor with the slight extra efficiency of a woman who is processing information and keeping it strictly to herself. Ruth noticed by noon and chose to express it by producing a significantly better than average lunch without comment. James, who noticed nothing unless it was directly horse-related, noticed nothing. Caroline worked through the accounts with one part of her attention and held the rest of it in a kind of careful custody. Not the cautious containment of the previous months, but something more like curation. She was keeping the feeling close on purpose. She had spent so much of her life pushing feelings into filing systems and desk drawers that the act of choosing to hold one, to look at it directly and say, yes, this is real. That act itself was a practice. She was practicing it deliberately. By late afternoon, she had finished the quarterly summary and started a letter to Margaret Cole about the medicinal herb sources she'd asked about, and she was midway through it when Nathaniel appeared in the study doorway. "I need to talk to you about November," he said. She set down her pen. "The hearing." "Yes." He came in and sat. "My lawyer wrote this morning. Bennett has filed a supplementary document, a second witness." She went still. "Who?" "A man named Gerald Pruitt. He worked as a farmhand on the original property before I bought it." He set the letter on the desk between them. She reached for it. "According to Bennett, Pruitt is willing to testify that I pressured the previous owner into the sale." She read the relevant section. Her jaw tightened. "Pressured how?" "Unspecified in this filing, which means they're still constructing it." She looked up. "They're building the story around the witness instead of finding a witness for the story." "That's my read." "Then the witness is purchasable." She said it flatly without flinching, because she had grown up watching her father purchase testimony in various forms, and she had no illusions about how it worked. "Which means Pruitt is a liability, not an asset, because a purchased witness can be repurchased." Nathaniel looked at her. "Or discredited." "Can he be discredited?" "My lawyer thinks so. Pruitt has a history, 2 prior disputes in Henrico County, both settled under questionable circumstances. He's got a reputation in that county." Nathaniel paused. "It's not certain, but it's workable." She thought for a moment. "My father is spending money on this, more money than he has. He filed the first claim, it failed, and now he's buying a second witness." She looked at the letter. "He's desperate, or angry," Nathaniel said. "Men like your father, when they stop being able to control something, the anger is its own fuel. It doesn't require a rational return on investment." She knew that. She knew it in her body, the specific texture of her father's anger, the way it operated independently of logic or strategy once it reached a certain temperature. "He's angry at me," she said. "Yes." "Good." She said it clearly. "That means I'm doing something right." Nathaniel looked at her with that expression, the warm, contained thing that had been getting steadily less contained since the night before. "Yes," he said. "You are." She handed the letter back. "What do you need from me?" I need you to go to Richmond with me, when we see the judge." He said it without preamble. "I want you in that room." She had expected to be asked to wait. She had prepared herself for it, the reasonable argument that her presence might complicate things, that it was better managed without her in the room, that he would handle it and tell her afterward. She had prepared her counter-argument. She didn't need it. "When?" she said. 2 weeks. "I'll be ready." He nodded. Rose was at the door when she said Nathaniel. He stopped. "Last night," she said. She held his gaze. I don't need you to say anything further about it. I said what I said because it was true, and because keeping true things in desk drawers is a habit I'm working to break." She paused. "But I want you to know that I'm not frightened of it. What I said. I'm not going to take it back in the morning because the night felt large." He looked at her for a moment. "I know you won't," he said. "Good." "I won't either," he said, and he went out. She turned back to Margaret Cole's letter and smiled at the page just briefly, where no one could see it. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the busiest she had known since arriving at Whitaker Hall, which was saying something, because it had not been a quiet 3 months. There was the regular work of the household in harvest's final push, the accounts, the provisions for winter. There was the ongoing correspondence with Aldridge. There was Colbert, who needed his original survey notes organized and copied for the court. There was Pruitt's background, which Nathaniel's lawyer was assembling into a documented portrait of unreliability, with the methodical precision of a man building a wall, one careful stone at a time. And there was the new thing that existed between her and Nathaniel, which had no name, they'd given it yet, but which operated through every day with a different quality than before. He touched her shoulder in passing, now lightly, the way he had in the hall the night of her father's first visit, but more often with less studied carefulness and more simple habit. She found herself reading things aloud to him in the evening's passages from the books in the library that she was working through, with the appetite of someone who had been reading her mother's Bible and her father's account books for 6 years, and was now suddenly in a room full of the rest of the world's thinking. He listened, and argued, and agreed, and occasionally said, "Read that part again," and the evenings had taken on a warmth that she stored carefully against harder times. She was also in those 2 weeks doing something she hadn't told him about yet. Margaret Cole had connections she hadn't expected. She was smarter and better networked than a quiet conversation about herbs at a harvest party would suggest. And when Caroline had followed up their meeting with a letter, Cole had written back with a thoroughness that was clearly the response of someone who had been waiting for this kind of conversation. The letter covered medicinal herbs, yes, but also buried in the third paragraph, like something tucked between pages, a mention of the small lending library she maintained at her property, and the reading group she had quietly organized for the women of the county, and the tutoring she offered to the children of the tenant farmers whose parents couldn't afford schooling. Caroline had written back within the day. By the second week, she had a meeting scheduled with Margaret Cole, 3 other women she hadn't yet met, and Aldridge's wife, who turned out to be quietly formidable in her own right. The meeting was about establishing something more formal: a lending library with a proper lending system, a regular reading group, and an expansion of the tutoring into something that could reach more children. She hadn't told Nathaniel because she was still organizing the shape of it. She wasn't hiding it. She was building it properly first. This distinction mattered to her. She had spent years managing things quietly because quiet management was the only management that didn't result in consequences. She was managing this quietly because she wanted to bring it to him already built, already real, already hers, not as a request for permission, but as a fact. She was learning the difference. It was a slow education. The night before they left for Richmond, she told him. They were in the study. Late, the lamp burning low, the household asleep around them. She set down the book she'd been reading and said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her over his own papers. She told him about Margaret Cole, about the lending library, the reading group, the tutoring expansion, about Aldridge's wife and the other women, and the meeting she'd attended 2 days ago, at which they had laid out a real structure and a real plan, about the building at the edge of the Cole property that was unused and could be fitted for the purpose, about the numbers she'd worked out, the cost of books and basic supplies, the volunteer hours, the children who would benefit. She told him all of it, clearly, completely, without apology. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How much?" She named the figure. He nodded. "All right." She blinked. "All right." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "You've done the numbers. I can see you've done the numbers. Did you expect me to argue?" "I expected you to have questions." "What children are you starting with?" She had a list. She gave it to him. He listened to that too, asked 2 specific questions about the Cole property building's condition, and when she answered them, having already assessed the building and noted the 2 repairs needed, he nodded again. "When do you want to start?" he said. "Spring," she said. "After the winter. Give us time to collect books, organize the lending system, do the repairs properly. I'll speak to Cole's husband about the building repairs. He shouldn't carry that cost alone." He picked up his papers again. "It's a good idea, Caroline." She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 3 months with increasing attention, and she was still sometimes caught off guard by him. By the particular way he occupied the concept of a good man, not performatively, not with the self-satisfaction of someone who knows he is good and wants credit for it, but practically, functionally, the way he occupied everything. He decided what was right, and then he did it, and that was the whole of it. "I love you," she said. She hadn't planned to say it again this soon. It simply came out cleanly and directly, the way true things come out when you stop filtering them. He set down his papers, looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's not a response." "No," he agreed. He looked at her steadily, and she saw in his face the specific wrestling of a man who has held himself tightly for a long time and is in the ongoing deliberate process of choosing differently. "I love you," he said. I have been failing to say it adequately for some time. I apologize for the inadequacy." She felt the laugh before she knew it was coming. It was the laugh she'd almost had in October, the one she'd caught before it escaped. Except this time she let it go entirely. It was warm and genuine and completely undignified, and she pressed one hand over her mouth for a moment, and then lowered it and said, "You apologized for not saying it adequately." "I'm aware." "Nathaniel." "Yes." "That," she said, "is the most you thing that has ever been said." Something moved through his expression, the warmth larger now, and underneath it, the particular easing of a man who has stopped bracing. He almost smiled. She was learning his almost smiles the way you learn a language, one increment at a time. "Go to bed," he said. "We ride at dawn." "I know." She rose, took the lamp, stopped in the doorway. "Nathaniel." "Yes." "Tomorrow is going to be all right," she said. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "It is." She went to bed and slept deeply and without interruption for the first time in months. The Circuit Court in Richmond was a two-story building that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the particular formality of a space where decisions are made and recorded. Caroline had been inside it once before, years ago, accompanying her father on some business she hadn't been told about and had been required to wait in the hall. She had sat in that hall for 3 hours and read the same 4 pages of the book she'd brought because she'd been too anxious to absorb anything. Today she walked through the front door. Nathaniel's lawyer was there. Harmon, a precise and unhurried man in his 50s, who had handled Nathaniel's legal affairs for 8 years, and whose initial coolness toward Caroline had thawed into something that approached professional respect over the past weeks of correspondence. Colbert was there, the surveyor, with his original notes in a leather case. Aldridge was there because she had asked him to be, and because he was the kind of man who came when he was needed. Her father was there. She saw him as soon as they entered the room. He was seated at the far side with his lawyer, a younger man she didn't recognize, and the witness Pruitt, who was heavy-set and avoided looking at anyone directly. Her father looked up when she came in. His expression went through several things very quickly: surprise, calculation, and then the smooth reforming of his social face, the default performance. She looked at him steadily, and then looked away. She did not require anything from his face today. The hearing was formal, but not dramatic. Circuit Court business in 1818. Virginia moved at its own pace and according to its own conventions, and Harmon navigated both with the ease of long practice. Colbert's testimony was clear and well documented. The surveyor remembered the 1815 sale. His notes had confirmed the assessed rate and said so without equivocation or the slightest indication that he could be rattled. Pruitt, when his turn came told his story about pressure and coercion with the specific flatness of someone reciting lines they've been given, and Harmon picked it apart with the patience of a man who has done this before and has no hurry about it. Pruitt's Henrico County history came into the record. His inconsistencies were noted. By the time Harmon finished, Pruitt was looking at the floor, and her father's lawyer was making very small notes on his paper, with the posture of a man revising his expectations. Caroline sat through all of it, straight in her chair, her hands in her lap, her face composed. She was not managing the composition. It was simply what she was. At one point, the judge asked a question about the original property's boundaries, and Nathaniel leaned slightly toward Harmon to answer it. And under the table, very quietly, Caroline put her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held it. They held hands under the table in the Richmond Circuit Court, while the judge made his notes, and she kept her face composed and her back straight, and let herself feel in the privacy of that held hand the fullness of what this moment contained. 4 months ago, she had stood at an altar and looked at a point past a stranger's left shoulder and survived. Today she was sitting in a courtroom with her name on his deed and her hand in his, and the understanding that what had begun as survival had become through the daily accumulation of honest living something else entirely. Something she had not known was available to her. Something she would spend the rest of her life, she thought, taking care of. The judge ruled in under 20 minutes. The claim was dismissed. The documentation was sound, the witness unreliable, the case without merit. He said it with the economy of a man who has made the decision and sees no reason to ornament it. Thomas Bennett stood when the ruling was read. He was very controlled. He did not make a scene. He was, as always, too practiced for scenes that wouldn't serve him. He looked at Nathaniel. Then for a long moment, he looked at Caroline. She met his eyes. He had looked at her, her whole life, as if she were an item in a ledger, an asset when useful, a liability when not a line to be managed. I was looking at her now, and she could see him revising, and the revision was not comfortable for him. She held his gaze, not with hostility, not with the specific satisfaction of winning, though there was some of that, she was honest enough to admit it, but with something steadier and more durable than satisfaction, with the simple, complete fact of who she was and where she stood. He put on his hat. He walked out. The door of the circuit court closed behind him. She watched it close. Nathaniel's hand in hers tightened briefly. She tightened hers in return. Aldridge reached across from her other side and shook Harmon's hand and said something about the Pruitt issue being handled admirably. Colbert was gathering his survey notes with the pleased efficiency of a man who has been useful and knows it. The room was moving around them, and she sat in the middle of it and felt something she had been working toward for months arrive quietly and completely, like the last piece of a well-constructed argument. It was over. And she was fine. And she was here. The ride back from Richmond was quieter than the ride down had been. They had talked on the way down strategy, logistics, the specific structure of Harmon's plan, and on the way back they were largely quiet, but it was the deep, comfortable quiet of people who have come through something together and are processing it at their own pace. After a while, Nathaniel said, "How are you?" "Good," she said. Then more honestly, "Tired, but the good kind." "Yes." A stretch of road, a farmstead passing to the left. "He's not going to stop," she said. "You know that." "I know. He'll find another angle eventually. He always does." She paused. "But the angles are getting worse. He's running out of legitimate ones." "He's running out of all of them," Nathaniel said. "A man who has to purchase testimony is a man who has no facts. When the money runs out, so does the strategy." She thought about this. "He's going to hit bottom eventually." "Probably." "And when he does—" She paused. This was the part she'd been working on. The part that was not about fighting or protecting or standing firm, but about what came after all of that. "I don't want to be in a position where his bottom is my problem. I've been thinking about his remaining property." Nathaniel looked at her. "He has the Bennett house and 11 acres, she said. "Most of the furniture is worth something. The silver certainly is. If he sold it properly, not in desperation, not to whatever buyer materialized. First, he could clear his remaining debts and have enough left to live modestly on for the rest of his life." She paused. "I'd like to help him do that. Not because I owe him anything. Because if he does it properly, he stops being a problem, and I would rather he stop being a problem than continue managing him indefinitely." The silence was thoughtful. "You'd manage the sale," Nathaniel said. "I know what everything is worth. I grew up in that house." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "Aldridge would handle the legal side. I'd handle the valuation and the buyer correspondence. It would take 3 months probably." She paused. "He won't like it." "No. He'll see it as charity." "It is in a manner of speaking. I'd frame it differently," she said. "I'd frame it as a business arrangement. He engages me as an agent. I manage the sale on his behalf for a fee. The fee is nominal because I'm choosing to make it so, but the structure gives him enough dignity to accept it." She finally looked at Nathaniel. "I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it because I want to be done. I want this chapter to be finished, and I want to have finished it on my own terms, not just survived it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was behind her, and he was reading her face the way he always did, carefully, completely. "That," he said, "is one of the most considered things I have ever heard anyone propose about their own worst enemy." "He's not my worst enemy," she said. "He's my father. That's worse than an enemy in some ways, and better in others." "Do you want me to approach him?" "No," she said. "I'll do it. He needs to hear it from me." She paused. "I'll bring Aldridge, and I'll write the letter first. Tell me when you're ready to send it." "I will." She turned back to the road. "I'll write it tonight." She wrote it that night. She sat at the study desk with a clean sheet of paper and a sharp pen, and she wrote it 3 times until it said exactly what she meant. Businesslike without warmth and without cruelty. A proposition with clear terms and a logical structure that gave her father, if he was paying attention, the most obvious path to the end of all of this. She sealed it, wrote his name on the outside, and set it on the corner of the desk. Nathaniel came in at some point and looked at the envelope but said nothing. "In the morning," she said. "In the morning," he agreed. Her father responded in 11 days. The response was short and covered exactly 1 page and contained no apology and no acknowledgement of anything that had happened, which she had expected. What it said in the measured language of a man who had run out of alternatives and knew it was yes. The process took 3 months as she'd predicted. She worked through it with Aldridge's help and her own knowledge of every object in that house, every piece of land, every creditor's name and amount. She was methodical. She was thorough. She was, as Nathaniel had said once about the accounts, the right person for the thing. She did not see her father during those 3 months. The business was conducted through letters and Aldridge's office. She did not require his presence, and he did not offer it, and that arrangement suited them both. When the last document was signed, and the last debt was settled, and the small remaining sum was deposited to his account at the Richmond Bank, Aldridge wrote to her with the final confirmation, and she read it at the breakfast table and set it down and picked up her coffee. Nathaniel looked at her over the paper. "Done. Done," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "How do you feel?" She considered the question seriously. She had developed the habit of considering his questions seriously because he asked them seriously and deserved serious answers. "Like I put something down that I'd been carrying for a very long time," she said. "Not just the last few months, years." She paused. "I feel lighter." He nodded. She could see him absorbing that, holding it the way he held things that mattered. "Good, good," he said. The school opened in April. Not a grand opening. Caroline was not interested in grand openings, which were mostly about the people opening things, and not about the thing itself. It opened on a Tuesday morning, when the weather was finally warm enough to be reliable in the fitted-out building on the Cole property, with 12 children and 4 lending library members, and Margaret Cole, who had been the organizing force throughout the winter, and whose energy for the project had not diminished once in 4 months of planning. Caroline stood in the back of the room and watched the first hour. Watched the children with their slates. Watched the woman teaching a young widow named Susanna, who had been a schoolteacher before her marriage and had been delighted to be one again. Watched the whole quiet, ordinary, miraculous fact of children learning things in a room built for the purpose. Nathaniel stood beside her. He had come without being asked. She hadn't expected it, and then she had, because of course he had come. This was his wife's school, and he was the kind of man who showed up for the things that mattered to the people he loved. She leaned very slightly toward him, just a degree, her shoulder almost against his arm. He shifted, closed the distance, his arm against hers. They stood like that in the back of the room and watched 12 children learn to read on an April Tuesday, and she felt the full weight of the last year move through her, all of it. The altar and the carriage and the broken glass and the letter from her father and the circuit court and the quiet evenings in the study and the 3 words in the leather book and the 6 steps across the floor and his heart running fast under her hand. She felt all of it settle the way things settle when they find their proper place, and she understood that this was what surviving had been for. Not just to endure, to arrive somewhere, to build something real in ground that was finally honestly hers. She found his hand without looking. He held it. Outside, the Virginia Spring was doing what Virginia Springs do, filling every available space with growing things, insistent and generous, and entirely indifferent to the struggles of the people standing in it. Inside, a child sounded out a word and got it right, and looked up with the particular luminous pride of someone encountering their own capability for the first time. Caroline tightened her hand in Nathaniel's. He tightened his in return. And in that room, in that spring, in that life, she had built from the material of survival and the daily accumulation of honest trust. Caroline Whitaker was not afraid. She was not managing, not performing, not filing things away for later. She was standing in the back of her school with her husband's hand in hers, and she was entirely, completely, irreversible.